America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Hello, I'm your host, Robert Melso, and welcome to episode 12 of the Liberty Brief Podcast. The Corn Laws, How Government Sacrifice You as the Ruling Class Gets Rich. Today we'll be speaking again with Dr. Thomas Giordano, author of the book, Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. In our last episode, we discussed the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset and global warming, I meant climate change. If you thought COVID-19 was bad, buckle in. Climate change has become the new sky is falling down Armageddon battle cry for iron-fisted control of worldwide economies. Now, let me start out by saying I've been thinking. Here's a way to look at it. Whether you believe in climate change or not, if elites wanted to exert absolute control of the world economy, they'd first need to convince everyone there was an existential crisis and that only a centralized command and control government could save the planet. Well, what could be better than climate change? Now they can all fly from their coastal vacation homes on their carbon-spewing personal jets to Davos and to work out a way to force everyone except the biggest offenders, China and Russia, to reduce carbon emissions. Everyone meaning you. Now, you might already be convinced that the ice caps will melt, that the oceans will rise, and the world will end in 10 years, as we've all been told countless times. But all the while, coastal elites aren't yet abandoning their Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and Rehoboth Beach shorefront properties. You can at least ponder that and why that might be. Now, Tom, before I bring you in, I know you're probably chomping at the bit to discuss that a little bit or to weigh in. So let me let you in there.
Yeah. It's just absolutely unbelievable. They believe the world's going to end and, we're going to be under, a mile of water. And yet they go out and spend $12 million on mansions right on the beach. And these people are morons. Listen. Let me tell you something, Rob. If you really, truly thought that the world was going to end in 10 years, wouldn't you concentrate every single second of the day trying to resolve the problem? Instead, we've got all these other things that are going on. Wouldn't it be the primary concern of every single government in the world? But they're not. But they're not doing anything out of the ordinary. This reminds me of when I was a kid. When we were kids, we were during the Cold War. We were going to get hit with nuclear weapons. They were going to drop the bomb on us. So every once in a while, we'd have these emergency air raids in school. We'd have to jump under our desks. If we were in the hallway, we'd have to hug the wall. They tried the same stuff with, Russian nuclear weaponry in the 60s.
Well, Tom, you sound like a science denier to me.
Oh, yes. No, I don't deny science. I deny these people. It's that simple. I don't deny science. These people don't know what they're talking about.
Well, meanwhile, if you think that giving absolute economic dominance to governments will have a good outcome, you might need to refresh your memory on the predictable human suffering and misery that can happen when your friendly neighborhood centralized government takes over the economy. Now, today, we're going to discuss a great example right from the 1800s. Now, I know what you're thinking. We're talking about the 1800s, but the lessons needed to be learned, and they apply even more today. And we're going to try to explain why that is. We're about to relive this insanity on a global scale, so it has a lot of relevance today. We're really talking about a handful of elitists effectively controlling a nation's economy and exacting inhumane cruelty on the whole population. Does that sound familiar? Now, we're going to look at protectionist legislation, but this same kind of irresponsible, blind satisfaction of the whims of a few can have devastating effects on the entire society. We'll be talking about the Corn Laws, and if you don't know what those are, they were early 19th century Great Britain's example of just such insanity. I think we could start by giving some historical background to those parliamentary acts and then go on to those who benefited, who they harmed, and when they were abolished, and some of the lessons that were supposed to have been learned but were continually ignored by those acts. So let me first define what is meant by protectionism. It's basically a passing of laws which protect the interest of a small group of people to the detriment of the rest of society. Usually that small group is part of the power elite in government or of a wealthy group of people in society from which politicians, by assisting them, will benefit. We have it in our own government today. Immunity from prosecution from insider trading in the stock markets for members of Congress. Well, that's a perfect example. The Corn Laws were in effect in Great Britain from 1815 until 1846. So for 31 years, count them, 31 years, they lasted until they were repealed. So now I'm going to officially bring you in, Dr. Tom.
Okay.
And let's jump right into our discussion.
Okay. Hi, Rob. Officially, hi, Rob. I hope the week went well for you.
It did. It was just fine. I was sorry to hear about the death of Queen Elizabeth, and I'd like to express our condolences to the nation and to King Charles and the rest of their family and to the British people.
I concur with your sentiments. The Queen was steadfast in her respect for the tradition and did honor, really, to the institution of the British monarchy. I believe her loss will be felt on both sides of the pond. But our British cousins have always been a resilient people. They'll go forward as they always have.
I don't know. To be in power for 70 years and not get killed or taken out of power. I think I'd last for about 30 seconds, but she was one of a kind.
Oh, yeah, she was. She was a very, very impressive woman.
All right.
Very impressive. Just think of the history that woman saw. It was just unbelievable. Unbelievable.
All right. I'm sure, Dr. Tom, before we get into the details of these laws, the Corn Laws, can you give us a brief overview of just what was going on in Great Britain at the time of their passing? I mean, these kinds of measures were coming down from government legislators. They just don't happen in a vacuum.
No, you're right. You're right. They never do. Well, let's take a little stroll through Western history of the times, all right? The American Revolution had been won, and the United States was in its infancy. Great Britain had massive debt from the loss to the Americans, and taxes were incredibly high from at least the latter part of the 1780s. So just in the beginning, we have high taxation, and I mean really high, somewhere like 400% on tea. It was really high. Smuggling had become a way of life in places like Cornwall, and the entire southwest of the English coast was involved in some way with black markets and illegal imports from the Channel Islands and France. These activities were active even through the Napoleonic Wars and well after. The War of 1812 between Great Britain and the United States over British violations of U.S. maritime rights came to an end in February of 1815, with some ratifications made to the Treaty of Ghent, signed after the Revolutionary War. From the American point of view, this war not only sought to eliminate the impressment of American merchant sailors on the open seas into the British Navy. In other words, they were kidnapped and thrown into naval service for the Brits. But to overcome the blockage of trade, the pressures that caused the War of 1812 with us erupted from the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Though the U.S. was neutral in the conflict, both Britain and France were determined on stopping America from trading with each other. They were both severely hampering American trade interests.
Dr. Tom, it sounds like a sticky situation for us.
It was. The British Navy was the greatest in the world at the time. In any case, we were talking about Great Britain. This meant more debts, compounding their older debts. So now they were compounding the debts from the War of 1812 with the debts from the Revolutionary War that they lost. And as we go along, after the Napoleonic Wars begin to end, it starts to get a little sticky for them.
Sounds like it's about time to inflate some of their money.
Well, no, not in that case. Well, no, it's similar. It's similar, but this is on the supply side, the inflated expenses.
Oh,
this isn't monetary. Okay. Well, we'll get to that. We'll get into that. But getting back to them, we cannot forget that within this same time frame, from about 1760 to about 1840, Great Britain and the rest of the Western world was experiencing an industrial revolution. Innovations in machinery driven by water wheel and steam were entering into mass production of non-agricultural goods on an ever-increasing scale, driving a mass internal migration from the farming countryside to ancient urban centers for jobs in the cities that weren't prepared for the flood of the people. They just couldn't keep up with the pace of the influx to provide living accommodations. So additionally, the British Isles are just that. They're islands. So the mass internal migrations for better paying opportunities in urban industry were leaving arable land fallow, and these lands were being purchased at really alarming rates by the elites in government and being turned into massive estates to produce edible produce for the war effort against Napoleone. So there was a rush to get these lands, and the prices were increasing with the decrease in availability. Now, here's the thing. Many members of parliament were taking out huge loans at high interest to purchase as much land as they could. It turns out that feeding their soldiers was a very, very lucrative enterprise, especially since they themselves were setting the price, or the prices, I should say, and funding the expenses through legislation.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. We know the land will always have some value because it's finite. It's a finite resource.
Exactly.
And it turns out they're not making anymore.
Exactly. They're not making anymore. Yeah, that's right. But what amazes me the most about this is that the British members of parliament were very well educated in Roman history. I mean, easy parallels could have been drawn between what they were doing and what the senators of the Roman Republic in the 2nd century before Christ had done, which led to social upheaval, the land reform acts, and the murder of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius.
I don't remember the Gracchi brothers. I thought they were from South Philadelphia. But,
yeah. Oh, come on. How could you not remember the Gracchi brothers? Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. How could you not remember them?
This was BC, I'm guessing.
Yes. It was the 2nd century before Christ, right? All
right. Very good. There's some history there. I remember reading that, weren't they going somewhere on the Appian Way for miles, and didn't they see some abandoned land, and what happened there?
Well, yes, it was Tiberius Gracchus. He got on his horse and rode miles and miles up the Appian Way and saw all this fallow land. There was nobody on the land that was tilling it or doing anything else. But on the other hand, Rome was completely overcrowded with unemployed farmers and retired legionnaires. In other words, the senators had purchased up all of the land outside of Rome for miles, and they were just not utilizing it. So that's the problem. There was a great influx of people into Rome, and it caused a lot of problems. The only real difference, though, was that in Britain, the people were migrating to the industrial centers. In other words, they were going looking for jobs, whereas in Rome, these people were just displaced. But at that particular time in Rome, there was the importation of about 20,000 new slaves per month. So the plebeian farmers were getting booted from their lands and their jobs, and they had nowhere to go but the city. So there was a little bit of a difference.
So you're saying that the members of parliament, they understood this history very well.
Oh, yes. Sure.
But didn't heed it regardless.
Exactly.
It sounds like a little bit like what we're doing with inflation right now, printing money. Like it never happened that destroyed an economy before.
Yeah, well.
So lessons learned, but the lessons that should have been learned aren't remembered.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the Corn Laws. I'd like to clarify what is meant by corn. It wasn't what we Americans think of when we hear that word, like sweet Jersey corn.
No, it wasn't. At the time, the British referred to all cereal grains as corn in general, like wheat, barley, rye, and the like. It was a general term for those foods, for these types of foodstuffs. So, all
right. So the Corn Laws related to corn, no bread, a lot of the other things that you can make from flour from these cereals.
Right. And also animal feed, So, you got to feed animals too, right?
Right.
So
if they start restricting this, as I think we're going to go into, they start completely messing with the livelihoods of these people and their ability to eat.
Right. Exactly.
All right, so let's continue. What exactly happened?
Well, the British victory at Waterloo in 1812 happened. The defeat of Bonaparte has started the downward slide of the French Empire. And with the war coming to an end, those guys in the British Parliament saw the writing on the wall. They expected food prices to fall. They knew they were about to be clobbered with the loss of an easy cash stream when the soldiers started to return, and imported corn from the continent would start returning to their shores. Obviously importing grain from abroad was not in the interests of those British MPs and other landowners.
What are MPs? Members of Parliament?
Members of Parliament, yeah.
Right.
Members of Parliament. They were desperate to avoid being on the hook for huge amounts of loans that jeopardized not only what they had purchased in this time frame, but all of their ancestral assets. The war ended in 1815, and along comes the Congress of Vienna and the eventual Treaty of Vienna. Now, the primary objective of the treaty was to undo the changes enacted in Europe during the reign of Napoleone and return to their status quo ante, to create a new conservative order in Europe, to restore the monarchies which were overthrown by Napoleone, and to set fixed national borders for France. After the treaty, we must also remember that every nation involved in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe was now obligated to pay war debts to international bankers, with one exception, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which was the new name for the Kingdom of Naples.
I think I get where you're going. These parliamentarians passed the Corn Laws to protect themselves, their own personal interests at the expense of the British people. Some things never change, do they?
You're right. And the Irish and the Welsh and the Scots. It wasn't just the Brits.
Okay.
They screwed everybody. Okay.
So how did the Corn Laws work?
Well, the Corn Laws were drafted and enacted, again, as protectionist measures in 1815 to restrict the amount of foreign grain that could be imported into the country. Duty-free grain from any foreign source was now to be granted if the domestic prices had reached a threshold of 80 shillings per quarter for wheat, 50 shillings for rye, and 40 shillings for barley. But those prices never occurred. In other words, they never met that threshold. So effectively, all importation was cut.
Were banned. They were banned. Okay, so what is a quarter? I don't think I've ever heard of that weight.
Well, a quarter is about 1/5 of a metric ton, or about 200 kilograms.
Wouldn't a quarter be 25%? Isn't 1/5 20%?
Yes, and don't ask me why. There must be a reason, but I have no idea why they use these metrics. Anyway, as time went on, even more stringent duties were placed upon imports, which made them completely unaffordable.
All right, so let's talk about the shilling. What would that be equivalent to today? What's a shilling equivalent to?
Well, the shilling was a silver coin that was first minted in the 1500s during the reign of King Henry VII. For centuries, there was a relative value ratio of 20 shillings to 1 pound sterling, and 1 shilling was equal to 12 pence. Now, if you remember our talk in the previous podcast about inflation, there was their equivalence of 20 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. Well, this is probably the tradition where the Americans got it. The 20-to-1 ratio seems to be something that's in the Anglophone countries. In any case, in that time frame, the shilling had a value of about $3.40 as bullion in today's terms, and its buying power would be roughly $6.25 today.
Well, this time you're not going to catch me with my pants down. I've got my calculator.
Okay.
So let's look at the buying power of $6.25 and multiply by 80 shillings. That comes to around $500. So $500 for 200 kilos of wheat. Mm-hmm. We're looking at $2.50 per kilo. Out of curiosity, do you know what the average wage was back then in England?
It is difficult to calculate today because it varied for sex and age, and also from place to place. I would guess a good average was about 15 shillings for a 6-day week with 12 to 14-hour work days for men, about 7 shillings for women, and about 3 shillings for children. In any case, their conditions were long hours, low wages, high incidence of severe injuries and health problems, and fines and harsh corporal punishment for errors and mistakes. There was also no job security, and the rapid industrialization was outpacing any kind of labor laws which could have protected the workers' interests. Additionally, 90% of the population was denied the vote, so they had no franchise in government to make any changes on a political level.
I'm sure it was much worse than we can describe it in words. I mean, I recall that there was a large number of orphans that worked in shifts for food, and they had a bunk bed attached to the factories. I get a picture of Charles Dickens type dystopian society.
Yes, that's right. They were called workhouse orphans or parish apprentices. Now, we're only talking about the factory workers here, okay? Factory. There was also the entire gamut of other trades and services in their society. And before you ask me why they worked under these conditions in the millions, right, you have to ask yourself what their alternatives were. Now, we may look at these conditions with disgust from our armchairs, in the 21st century, but they looked at them as a better alternative to whatever they were escaping from. So imagine.
Well, I suppose we could do a whole episode on this idea from our own country's experience during the Industrial Revolution and the Machine Age. But to stay on topic, what becomes obvious is that if the cereal grains become really overpriced, everything else does.
Yes.
Too, right?
Yes. And eventually, while the workers were working under harsh conditions, they were also living under harsh conditions. Cramped housing at expensive rates, sometimes 20 to a room with no heat, no plumbing and the like. In other words, they emigrated to improve their lot. They voted with their feet and found whatever advances they were making was being sucked up by trying to feed themselves. Food alone was taking more than 40% of their disposable income that would otherwise have gone into savings and things like that. And this was in an environment, as I said before, where there was extremely high taxation already on things like tea, tobacco, salt, and brandy.
Okay, so they've got their people shackled, basically.
Mm-hmm.
How did the parliamentarians justify these laws to their own people? Maybe they didn't have to because, 90% of them couldn't vote, but...
Well, but they still had to look, they only really superficially, let's say, rationalized their actions to themselves. They couldn't care less about the suffering of the people. They were completely disinterested. Their dishonest claims that they made were that relying on cheaper foreign corn would lower laborers' wages, if you could believe that. And introducing these severe measures would make Britain more self-sufficient. This didn't fool anybody. The only real motivation was protecting the financial interests of British landowners. The taxes imposed were intended to keep prices of cereal grains artificially high. That is, as high as they were during the Napoleonic Wars, to secure the same level of cash flow to that small group of people.
Well, how typical. So getting raked over the coals for food or starving to death was for the people's own good.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Interesting how that works, right? It sounds a lot like we're going through today with energy and the COVID bullshit. It's all for your own good, don't you know?
Yep.
Now I have to say, though, that in the 1600s, the British Parliament did play around with similar laws affecting cereal grains imported from elsewhere, but it was to the benefit of the people. You see, their purpose was to ensure a stable supply of grain while keeping the prices at a sensible level. This assured the farmers a stable profit while maintaining reasonable prices for the consumers. The mechanism was really simple. The mechanism was that when domestic prices rose, import duties were reduced to boost those foreign imports. When the prices fell, import duties were raised to keep the domestic prices in check. These laws, however, had a completely opposite purpose. They were to raise domestic prices and keep the foreign imports out.
You're talking about the corn laws. The corn laws.
The corn laws,
okay.
Yes.
So you said that no one was fooled by their thinly veiled justifications. I mean, well, couldn't the people in government understand that what they were doing was immoral? Didn't they at least see the suffering of the people?
Oh, sure. But they were apparently completely indifferent. They were elitists. The public was becoming increasingly infuriated by what they were going through, and even their wages were beginning to be cut. Their frustration led to riots, especially in 1816, the year following the enactment of the laws, when the greed of the MPs merged with the wrath of God.
Okay. What was the wrath of God? I'm almost afraid to ask.
Well, it was a horror show. In the early spring of 1815, a volcano called Mount Tambora erupted in what was called then the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia today. It was 10 times more potent than the eruption of Krakatoa, which would happen almost 70 years later. The explosion ejected megatons of ash and sulfur dioxide way up into the atmosphere. And it took about a year for this cloud to cover the entire northern hemisphere of the Earth. So at the same time they were writing up these laws, this volcano was erupting in Indonesia. All right, so it was like a giant parasol had blocked the sun's rays and created a volcanic winter and acid rain. This catastrophe was added to the late effects of the period of global cooling that lasted from the 14th to the 19th centuries. We refer to it today as the Little Ice Age. Okay, these two events were enough to lower the average temperature of the Earth, throwing a monkey wrench into global weather patterns. So in 1816, the entire northern hemisphere went from early spring right back into winter. The year had no summer or fall, just one long winter. And the resultant cold weather caused crops to fail, which then caused famines across the world. These poor Brits had their MPs, geology, climate, and God himself hammering every aspect of their lives into the ground.
Sounds like the perfect storm. So what were the consequences? I'm guessing, I can imagine how the people would have reacted, but could you lay out some of the more important effects?
Oh, Rob, there were so many consequences that it's practically impossible to catalog them. But let's just say that, that they were obviously political and economic, social, and demographic results. Politically, all this just reinforced the average person's view of an uncaring, indifferent political class. The public opinion of the MPs was lower than whale crap, and anti-government sentiment was through the roof. The MPs couldn't go out in public without an armed escort. It sounds like today. It sounds like today in America. The only part of the private sector that was happy were the independent farmers and their associates whose fortunes hung on the coattails of those in government. They were indirectly favored by these laws. Eventually, the politicians would have, they would have to move, but it would take about 31 years. Decades of misery, and even then, it was kicking, screaming, and scratching. Throughout this period, throughout this entire period, the people saw their government as criminal. Interestingly, the people in government saw their people as criminal. To overcome these excessive legislative measures, the smuggling industry that was present from the 1780s expanded, and black market commerce in these goods exploded. There was so much of it that it got to the point where just by eating, you were committing a crime. Everyone in Great Britain was a criminal. The only difference was whether you were on the side of the morality of supporting yourself and your family, or the immorality of self-serving greed at the expense of the population. Corruption at all levels of government bureaucracy was a standard operating procedure. Great Britain was viewed by the rest of the world as the most unlawful nation in Europe. And also, these activities were taking a huge chunk out of the government revenues. between 20 and 25%. Now, we have to remember that there was no personal income tax in Great Britain at the time. Their entire revenue came from import duties and direct taxes.
If that was the case, how could the MPs that were benefiting from all of this continue by cutting the imports that they were taxing to run their government? It just doesn't seem to make logical sense to me.
No, Rob, remember, what was going on at the time? The Industrial Revolution and large-scale manufacturing of non-agricultural goods. The imports of raw materials and the exports of finished manufactured goods was driving one of the most dynamic economies in the world at the time. Great Britain was in a transition period from an agricultural base to an industrial base. I mean, our own country lagged behind them about a decade, maybe two. And our Civil War was a manifestation of that same kind of transition, probably more than any other cause.
Yes, I remember that we were in a transition period. The North versus the South was a manifestation of that. Mm-hmm. Farming versus manufacturing.
Right. It was a war between two different types of societies, an agricultural one and an industrial one.
Right. So what you're saying is that the loss of revenues from imported grain was offset by primary materials for industry.
Yes, and then some. In fact, gradually over that 31-year period, there had been several calls for reason to remove the tariffs. You know, as the growing industrial community became wealthier and garnered more political power, their voices as proponents of free trade began to be heard. They posited that free trade would benefit international relations, increase employment, and lift Britain's economy even more. In reality, these reasons were just a ruse. Factory owners and other employers believed that if the tariffs were not lifted, they would be forced to raise workers' wages because people were having to spend more on basic necessities such as bread.
Well, I remember studying a little bit of this history back in college, and there were members of the Whig Party. They also opposed the Corn Laws, but even they didn't repeal them after they got into power in the 1830s. If I remember, there was an anti-corn law league set up by some manufacturers. Was it in Manchester?
Yes, Manchester. They were from Manchester.
So there were organized efforts to influence the members of Parliament to change their ways, to perhaps repeal these laws. I mean, repeal of these laws was difficult for the government to ignore for too long.
Yeah, well, I guess that depends on what you mean by too long. There was a Tory called Robert Peel, who was a reformer in his own way, who became prime minister a couple of times in the 1830s, and then again 1834 and 5, and I believe in 1841. But he made a lot of enemies within his own party when he flip-flopped on his opinions and support of Catholic freedoms to worship. You know, Peel was seeking wider reforms on British trade, which included the abolition of the Corn Laws. He started by reducing duties on many other imported goods like sugar and cotton. By 1844, though, corn slowly became the only subject left to address. It would take a horrific humanitarian disaster to finally put a human face to the negative effects of these protectionist laws.
Okay, so I was in Ireland. I think I know where you're going. I was in Ireland, and that was the Great Potato Famine.
Yes, you got it. Bingo.
And now, their diet still consists of a lot of potato dishes, as my waistline will attest.
Yes, you got it. The severe suffering of the Irish and Scots was something that could not be ignored by the British government. I won't go through all of the arguments back and forth on the issue, but many Tories saw the famine in Ireland as a weak excuse for the repeal, believe it or not. Eventually, though, the repeal passed with the support from the Whig Party, even though 2/3 of the Tories opposed it.
Dr. Tom, I'd like to hear your opinion. I'd like to hear your opinion on something. When I was in high school, our history teacher blamed the Irish themselves for the famine. He said it was their own fault, that they relied too heavily on one crop as a staple of their diet, and that when it when Ireland was hit by that fungus, they were destined to suffer just the way they did. Can you comment on this?
Sure. It's a myth, and it's also a lie. You know, your teacher should be ashamed of himself.
He's dead now, so I think we're okay.
Then he joined the ranks of the Irish who died in the famine. The poor Irish, you know, they didn't select the potato by choice. They were forced to rely upon it because the prices of other high-quality grains were completely outside of their ability to purchase. The fact is also that most of the grain and other high-quality foodstuffs were all exported to Britain. They were forced to rely on the potato. The famine only exacerbated the problem. And now even that crop was in very, very short supply.
You know, we were talking to some of the people in Ireland, and they were saying that during the potato famine, grain was being exported from Ireland. Britain was exporting Irish grain to themselves and other countries during the famine. I mean, how cruel is that?
It's just as cruel as what the Soviets did to the Ukrainians. You know, I mean, these people are heartless. It doesn't matter whether you're a communist despot or you're an MP despot. People die by these things. 7 million Ukrainians died, from starvation.
I think Ireland went from something like 8 million back down to 6, like 3.
They went from 9 million to 6.
Yeah.
9 million.
Some of that was emigration, though.
Yeah, well, let's clarify that. The response of the British government to this was just too little, too late. It was completely inadequate. They pushed the responsibility to respond onto the landlords of the farmers. And you're right. The Irish people that you spoke to were absolutely right. Everything that they were producing, aside from potatoes, was leaving the country. It was going to Britain. Okay? So these people found it impossible, these landlords found it impossible to financially support their struggling tenants. So their tenant farmers and their families were evicted en masse. The British government assisted primarily by granting loans and setting up soup kitchens. And they also started work projects for roads and other public works. But it helped very little.
I saw those public works. When we were going through the countryside, there's these little plots of land, no more than half an acre, maybe even less, walled off by stones. And these people were expected to tend these crops in these little patches.
Yes.
And some of the public works were just to build stone pathways. They paid them very little for that.
Yeah, the problem wasn't money. The problem was food. You know what I mean? You can't eat money. If there's no food to be purchased, what's the sense? Well, if you want, now, let's go over a little bit of what happened to the Irish people. This was a complete, a complete recipe for disaster. The effects on the Irish people were even worse than what happened to them at the hands of that bastard Cromwell a couple of hundred years before. Over a 4-year period, from 1845 to 1849, more than 1 million people died from starvation, malnutrition, and disease. Scotland had a similar fate, but to a lesser degree. Over the course of the famine, about another 2 million Irish emigrated to other parts of Britain, the United States, and Canada. We're talking a population reduction from about 9 million to about 6 million in a 7-year period from 1844 until 1851. All I can say is that from our point of view, from America's point of view, Great Britain's loss was America's gain. We gained a great people, okay? So
when we were in Ireland, they didn't talk about Cromwell too well.
No.
And I think he was responsible for killing whole villages, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. It's a story that's, let's say, it's too long of a story to get into. Let's just say that if you have any love or respect for the Irish, and the Scots, for that matter, you can't pronounce the name Cromwell without adding that bastard before it. And even this is being generous. What this animal did to those people during the interregnum was pure evil. His hanging and beheading for treason were too good of a punishment for him. But let's not discuss Cromwell. As it is right now, there are some people are trying to rehabilitate that bastard Cromwell's name. Good luck with that one. I don't see how you can rehabilitate a butcher of hundreds of thousands of people. But
Tom, you seem pretty irritated by the history of the Irish people.
I am irritated. I am. I have my reasons, and they're personal. Now, I have no Irish blood in me. I'm Italo-Greek and Italian. But when my grandmother died, my father, who was 3 years old at the time, went to live with a foster family of working-class Irish in Philadelphia, and they treated him with much love and affection until he could return home when he was 7. As for me personally, my godfather, for whom I am named, Thomas Lafferty, was one of the kindest and gentlest men I have ever known. When I hear of these abuses, I just can't help but see millions of my Uncle Tom and my cousins, Kevin, Kelly, and Tommy. In a way, I guess, one of the consequences of that bastard Cromwell's treachery, the Corn Laws, and the potato famine is my being called Thomas today. It's so
strange, isn't it, how these connections link us unknowingly to the past?
Oh, you're right. You're right. I don't even want to get into my own father's family's direct involvement in the French Revolt and the Napoleonic Wars in the Kingdom of Naples, and then the Two Sicilies. My family played a major role in southern Italy as Sanfedisti, defending la Corona del Re Ferdinando e la Regina Maria Carolina, as well as the church from the Jacobini. But this is way beyond the scope of this episode, and probably of little interest to anybody outside of Italy.
Well, one day I'd like to hear that story, but let's return. Okay, so just what legacy did the Corn Laws and the repeal have on Britain?
Oh, well, there were a few that we can cite. The first is political. The pandemonium in Parliament over these laws caused a rift in the Tory party, and it kept them from power for the next 30 years or so. Most of the Tories who had supported Peel joined an independent bloc, and many others would later join what became the Liberal Party. Now, this is not liberal that we have in the liberal sense. Liberal meaning freedom, okay? Not the perverted liberalism that we have in the United States, meaning some socialist bullcrap. The Irish never forgot the British government's indifference and complete insufficient response to the famine and their misery. These would influence later Irish nationalist movements for independence. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, for one, which would foster the 1916 Easter Rising many years later.
Well, I suppose there's no mystery why there's no love lost between the Irish and the British for many reasons.
Oh, volumes. But let's not confuse the British people for their government, okay? The British people were just as hard-pressed as the others. As I said, these decisions were made by elites. 90% of the common British were disenfranchised and played no role in the causes of their suffering. So
no, you're probably right. You're probably right. So go on.
Okay, so economically, those smuggling networks that were set up with continental Europe, the ones that were going on from the Revolutionary War with America, and then during the Napoleonic Wars, they immediately converted to legal import-export companies. The wiping out of the protectionist laws and resultant free trade exploded their economic activities across the entire kingdom. Practically overnight, the nation became the most law-abiding in all of Europe. What made them all criminals was the oppressive law. You get rid of the law, you get rid of the criminal. In other words, by the repeal of the Corn Laws and removing restrictions from imports and exports, Adam Smith's ideas were openly validated and free market economics took on a solid meaning.
So all of the chaos and misery of the era of the Corn Laws came to an end with an explosion of industry, commerce, free trade, and wealth. For all of its ills, maybe there was something positive that came out of it all, and maybe something positive will happen in America for all of its current ills.
Yeah, well, we can hope. But but also something so negative also resulted from it that gave rise to miscreants of all races and colors, leading to hundreds of millions of dead in the next century.
Okay, so now you're what are you talking about now?
Oh, Rob, come on. You're forgetting Karl Marx.
Oh, I wanted to forget him, but I guess he is there.
Yeah, well, I wish we all could forget him. He was thrown out of Paris. He went to Brussels and then arrived in London in 1849. This was at the tail end of the repeals, and England was still recovering in one sense, but still in the middle of a huge transition. The working and living conditions of the workers had not really been caught up with the industrialization. The suppression and the failures of the socialist revolts in Europe in 1848 caused a change in Marx's plans. Okay? He tried to capitalize, if I could use that word, on the remaining plight of the working class and tried to rekindle his Hegelian ethos. Though he wrote his manifesto in Brussels in 1848, it was in London that he penned Das Kapital in the middle of the 1860s.
You're right. That didn't even enter my mind. Wasn't Friedrich Engels, wasn't it he who brought him to London?
Yes, they went together, right.
Is it Frederick or Friedrich?
Well, he's German. It would be Friedrich Engels.
Right.
Engels was German. He wasn't English, but he accompanied Marx to London. Engels' father was a Prussian, if I'm not mistaken. He was a very, very wealthy textile industrialist. Engels was Marx's meal ticket for years. And Marx never worked.
Oh, well, that's a surprise.
Oh, that's a real surprise.
Shocker.
That's a shocker. Engels' meal ticket was his father. So, in a bizarre twist of hypocritical fate, Karl Marx was a parasite on Engels, and Engels was a parasite on his father, the kind of person both men vilified as being a bourgeois capitalist suppressor of the working class. So, that they indirectly lived off the very people they claimed to champion has to be one of the sickest jokes in human history. Marx spent all of his time looking for examples of exploitation, of the working man, which he never found, by the way. He never found people being exploited.
While he was exploiting somebody else.
Oh, yeah. While he was doing it. All he had to do was look in the mirror, and ask. You could also ask his maid. His maid was never paid by him either. My father described Marxism to a T. He said Marxism in all of its forms is a philosophy ideated by a parasite for other parasites, and that sums it up quite nicely. That says it all. But that also came out of the Corn Laws. So what can I tell you?
Well, I guess we should wrap this up a little bit. To summarize, the Corn Laws they're a perfect example of just how protectionism, today we'd call it crony capitalism, is not only damaging to society, but it has nothing to do with free market economies nor capitalism. It is just another form of ratified, legalized theft.
Exactly.
Now, people complain about crony capitalism, and they say that the only cure for that is socialist measures or more command and control from on high. In my view, they never really realize that the only reason crony capitalism can exist is when someone else comes in and distorts the free market.
Exactly right. The free market needs no control and centralization. That's the whole beauty of it. It is governed by immutable laws that are just as immutable as the laws of nature. Adam Smith called it the invisible hand. Capitalism, what we call capitalism, I would call it free market entrepreneurship. I would just call it that. Free markets.
Capitalism was a term coined by Karl Marx as a derogatory term.
Exactly. It was a derogatory term. Hey, listen, that's what they call it. So
fine.
Would you want, fine. Okay. You want to call it that? But you see, the thing is that when you start interfering with it, it's not capitalism. Capitalism does not admit slavery. It does not admit cronyism. It does not admit anything other than free market competition with no external controls. Okay. The market will dictate everything. The market does.
So I think I think what we could say, Tom, and I'm pretty sure you'd agree with me, is that when you start messing with free market economies, you start to get a bad result. And then when you get that bad result, you can say, hey, we have to save you people from the bad result that capitalism is foisting on you by introducing more rules and regulations, thereby empowering these few elites to even tighter control and more
exactly. It's
tyranny.
It's the same. It's more of the same. It's more of the same. It's a typical ploy.
Some things never change, do they, Tom?
No, they never change. They never change. The most moral form of economics that exists on this planet is a free will interaction between people who believe that they are both gaining from the deal. It's really that simple. Both people are satisfied in the deal. What could be better than that? It's entering into a common agreement, based upon free will. What could be immoral about that?
Okay, Dr. Tom, I'm with you on this. I hope our audience caught something of value in this discussion. I'm sure I did. Dr. Tom, now let's clue our audience into what's happening in the next podcast. We're going to talk about nuisance laws. Do you want to give a brief overview on that?
Oh, sure. Nuisance laws were laws that were with us for 800 years, for ever since the Magna Carta, Libertatem. And basically what it says was that you had a perfect right to enjoy your property without being disturbed. And this plays directly into industrialization in the United States. It plays directly into pollution, and it plays directly into the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which has turned into, a leviathan. And it's a perfect example of how when your unalienable rights are infringed, bad things happen, just like what happened with the corn laws.
Okay, so all of this is based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. Don't forget to pick up your copy on Amazon.
Barnes & Nobles, too.
Barnes & Nobles. And in the meantime, we will see you next time. You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.